All right, everyone, thanks so much for joining today. Appreciate y'all coming on by and spending your lunch hour with rvatech. We are excited for today's session, making your code easy to modify. We have a moderator and a series of panelists that will be taking you through the next hour on their experiences and their perspective on that topic. Before we get into it, though, excuse me, wanted to make you aware of a couple upcoming events we have. We have two big events coming up in May. On Thursday, May 13th, we have our virtual kickoff for our Drive conference presented by rvatech Women in Technology. So if you've attended that conference in person before, you'll know it's a fantastic event, usually really well attended with some great speakers. We are planning on executing it live in the fall, but we are doing a virtual kickoff for it on Thursday, May 13th. So that's just around the corner. Registration is open and live now at rvatech.com. And the second thing I wanted to let you all know about is our virtual career fair coming up on Wednesday, May 26th. Registration is open for that on our website for both job seekers and job placers and job holders. So if you are an employer, please check that out. We have booths available. And if you are a job seeker, please register and put it on your calendar. Again, that is Wednesday, May 26th. And both of those events, as well as others, are on our website at rvatech.com. All right, without further ado, I'd like to introduce today's moderator, Brian Bassett. Brian is the Director of Business Development over at SimpleThread. And I'll save you an extensive bio, but I did ask Brian for one fun fact, and he did explain to me that at one time, long ago in the past, he once went to Arizona. So, amazing. Brian, that sounds like an amazing travel story. Look forward to hearing it sometime. Brian, I'll pass it to you.
Thanks, Nick. Yes, I've been to Arizona. People park under like shade things. And if you go out with people at lunchtime from like an office, they actually have oven mitts that they use to hold the steering wheel. So it's like, I don't know, it's like being on a whole other planet. It's pretty cool. But that's not why we're here. Thank you, everybody. Thanks, Nick. Thanks, rvatech. We're here for the Tech It Yourself session entitled Making Your Code Easy to Modify. My name is Brian Bassett. As Nick said, I'm the Director of Business Development at SimpleThread, a local digital product agency based right here in Richmond and Charlottesville. I'm really excited to facilitate this discussion. I was asked to do this by one of the board members, Andre Goulet of Coreubytes, and this is a topic that I know we talk about a lot in our business. I know lots of folks who work in technology and software engineering. This is something that is discussed all the time. So we are joined by three excellent panelists who are much more adept and skilled at this topic than I am. But they are going to talk about how to modify code, or in the shorter parlance, create clean code. So we're going to talk about clean code a lot, not making your code easy to modify. Clean code's just the quick and dirty way to say that. So if you have questions, please be sure to throw them in the question box. We will be tackling them in kind of the back quarter of this hour. So we're going to be talking about a lot of different stuff. So without further ado, I definitely want to introduce our panelists. First, we have Chris Sills. She is a transformation principal at Red Hat. She has deep experience in software testing over her career, DevOps, transformation, and she is most notably right now, she started at Red Hat just about a year ago. Before that at Capital One. She's supported many services and software teams, especially in the kind of QA and testing space over her career. Kenny Hegland is a software engineer at Ipan Technologies, based here in Richmond. And he is a full stack engineer. He now works as a manager setting up infrastructure and helping his developers and engineers on his team to write better code. And similarly, Brad Phillips, who's a software engineer at RTS Labs. He came to town a couple of years ago. He's been at RTS for about 3 years, but he has deep and extensive knowledge in addition to his engineering work, working with other team members kind of on coding habits and kind of mentoring and kind of creating virtuous cycles on the team at RTS. So first panelists, I have a question for you. What is clean code? And so we'll just go down the row here. So Brad, why don't you start? What is clean code? How do you define it?
Yeah, sure. Hi, everyone. Clean code to me, it's a big thing with lots of different facets, and we'll try to dive into a lot of them. But I really think it's the practice and the discipline of making your code easy to read and easy to understand, so that when you come back to it or you need to change it, you don't have to spend all day being mad that you wrote it the first time. So.
Kenny, what does clean code mean to you?
Hey, I would kind of echo that same thought. Personally, when I come back to code, I don't really remember it much. I know I've met some people that can like pull back from a long time ago when they wrote their code, but I don't. So easier to understand. If it's well tested, easy to test, stuff like that. Just easy to work with generally.
Okay, so easy to work with, easy to read. Chris, any thoughts on what is clean code and how you might define it?
So I think I would start with it's self-documenting and reusable. One of the things that I work in an open source world, and I teach people a lot of the times how to work in that same open source world, which means other people are going to have to go and use what you're putting out there. And to me, if you're putting your work out in a public space that's going to be used by a broader audience, you want to keep it clean. You want to have it self-documenting, reusable, and something that somebody's going to want to like copy paste and use to showcase and do it another way as well.
You talked about, so we all as a panel got together last week and we're just batting ideas around, and I loved, I don't know where exactly you got it from, but you talked about this idea of dry kisses. Can you talk about dry kisses? I really liked that.
Yeah, so I think one time, gosh, it's been a few years ago, someone was describing clean code to me, and they were, talking in acronyms, and I just automatically put two of the acronyms together and said, it's like dry kisses. You don't repeat yourself and you keep it simple, stupid.
Yes.
You do things in smart ways. I read something recently about dry versus wet. Dry, you're not repeating yourself, whereas wet, you're writing everything, typing, right? And it's not really about the volume of code that you're writing. It's about the fact that you're doing it in simple ways that can be reused.
Yeah, that's great. And so, yeah, I was saying, I never thought about, dry and kiss, together and putting them together, but I thought that was a great kind of succinct way to talk about clean code. One question that came up to me as I was thinking about this over the last week is, are there, I'm gonna put Brad on the spot. Brad, are there empirical definitions of clean code? Can you say this code is clean, this code is not clean, or is it more of a smell kind of, nuance, intuition situation?
Yeah, I think there's things that you can look at and try to measure, right? Like from architecture principles and decoupling, and Chris is talking about those things when it comes to not repeating yourself. But I think at the end of the day, I would lean towards a no, right? I think I think writing clean code is a lot like making a good weld or any other craft skill, right? Like you kind of know it when you see it. There's an experience and a craft to it that comes with going through the practice of making better code and improving your code over time and cleaning it up from when you originally wrote it. So no, I think it takes a lot of trade skill to develop over time. And then, over time, you kind of learn to spot it when you see it.
Yeah, that's a great way to define it. So if clean code is, we have a general use or definition or practical definition, let's call it, of what it is. Why does it even matter? Why does creating clean code matter for your organization, for for your clients, for your bosses that maybe never have even looked at GitHub? Why does clean code matter in terms of like the business case or just in general, Kenny?
So it matters because a lot of your time is going to be spent reading code. So you'll do some development, but you got to understand what you're working on first. So that's one of the biggest things up front. And then maybe for the business, it's harder for them to kind of notice. Like if you're starting to implement clean code practices and testing and all that, it may lead to some slowdown at first. But I've been on a bunch of projects where it's just kind of over time, it just gets worse and worse and worse just because they're in a rush and they're stressed. And it just ends up to a longer time to actually develop stuff. And I think with stuff that's easier to read, easier to understand. Long term, it's going to be a benefit for even the business because people will eventually be able to deliver quicker. So,
okay. Yeah, Chris, what do you think about why clean coding practices matter?
So a lot of the times the work that I'm doing is teaching others and adopting new ways of working. And one component of that is around clean code, like getting smarter, more efficient in the way that you're doing software delivery. Um, you know, Brad was just mentioning something that I was thinking about it. I think about it from the perspective that clean code actually whispers to you, if you really think about it. From the perspective of when you're breaking the work down into smaller components, you increment and build on it, build and deploy, you'll get fast feedback. And that feedback can come from a person that's looking at your code as well, not just from the system that builds and deploys and says, hey, stop the build process, but really take heart of your code reviews. I think that's a practice that has kind of lost a little bit of its art, but like having the freedom to be able to call somebody out if you're seeing something that's just not looking right. Like, I think that's what's going to be what's important in building and deploying your software.
Yeah, so I think Kenny, I heard from you, you kind of were, hinting at technical debt a little bit, and then just this idea of kind of the community aspect. Brad, when we talked last week, we were just batting ideas around. One of the things that came up that we all agreed was you're going to be coming back to this code, right? So talk about that, like kind of the universality of like this is not the last time you will ever look at this code. So like, and then kind of how clean code and why it matters leads into that concept of you're going to return to this.
Yeah, absolutely. I'm going to steal this quote from I don't know who. I tried to Google it and I couldn't find a definitive answer, but there's a fundamental law in coding that reading code is harder than writing it. And, I think inevitably when you come back to code that you haven't touched in a month, you always struggle to remember the why and how we got there. I don't think anybody's come back to a code base and been happy and able to understand it quickly. That's just, everybody's mad at the last developer. That's a, an axiom. So really what we should be doing when we're writing code is optimizing for reading code, because that's the harder problem. There's very rarely a time in my career that I've been constrained by how fast I can write code. That's never the bottleneck. I spend all of my time, or the majority of my time, trying to understand past code that I've come back to either because there's a bug or I need to modify it for a client request or whatever it is that I need to, if I need to reuse the code, I need to be able to understand it to figure out how I can abstract it. So I have to be able to understand my code and read it. And when I'm writing my code, I'm very conscious of that fact that I'm going to be back here again, and I need to leave a trail of breadcrumbs so that I can understand what I was doing. I can understand this code, and shorten that time when I come back, so I can use that code again and keep it useful.
So I'm going to pose this to anybody. Anybody can jump in. So let's say I'm a business unit executive, and I have asked you to build an application, and I've asked you to do it on a pretty short time frame, and you've delivered it, and now you're able to catch a breath, but there's a sense of, oh, okay, like, we want to add more features to this thing. This thing is great, but could you imagine when we add X, Y, and Z to this thing? It's going to be incredible. But there's definitely some cleanup that needs to happen. How do you explain to someone who is not maybe never been an engineer in their career, understands what you're trying to accomplish and appreciates it, but how do you explain to them that, like, no, we need time, a month, a couple weeks, or a couple sprints, however you want to term it, to just make sure that this thing gets stabilized? Or do you not let yourself get into that place? That could also be a third way here is like, you just say you don't deliver unless it's clean. Like, how do you have those conversations with people that might not have the background or understand or appreciation for what is involved in making sure things stay healthy over time? Anyone?
I can dive in. I'm eager. Yeah, you answered. I was gonna challenge your question at first and say we shouldn't get in that state. We should just deliver good code the first time. But you already answered it. So good on you. You said you didn't know this stuff, but clearly you do. No, I think a lot of the time, this goes to when you're estimating new work, right? I think a lot of the times developers get caught in a cycle of estimating. When they're estimating work, especially changing code base, we estimate how long it would take to write from scratch. How long could I do this from scratch? And the reality is you need to get more aware of the cost of going back, getting refamiliar with the code you're touching, modifying that to be extensible or reused for the new feature, and including that work in your estimates, right? I know estimating is hard. We don't need it. That's a different panel at a different day. But a lot of it is making sure you're realistic about what that cost is, and go in knowing what those costs are going to be, that you're going to have to spend time making the code clean before you can reuse it or modify it, because trying to do anything else is not practical. It's going to be rife with bugs or all the bad things that happen.
Hey, Brad, I want to pose a question there and kind of like touch on that a little bit. Like, there's something to also just taking a little bit of a pause and inspecting what you have in place. And, I think there's also an opportunity for like those tech leaders that are on the team to take a minute and say, well, hold up leadership. Let's just take a pause and let's inspect what we have in place, and potentially, like, I hate to say chunkify, but like, what if we took just this chunk and did some inspect and adapt on this chunk? Let's take an increment of this, and let me show you how it could potentially be done just a little bit different. Not bite off the whole enchilada, right? Just let's take a little piece of that and make an increment of it and do something with it. Have you seen success there?
Yeah, absolutely. And I think, a term I've always used when I'm doing code reviews is Boy Scouting your code, which is, leave it better than you found it, right? So as you come back and touch code, you're not trying to re-architect to perfect. That's not what we're trying to get to. What we're trying to do is, clean code isn't a Boolean, right? It's a linear value, right?
Yeah.
So we're not trying to get from not clean to clean. What we're trying to do is keep our code as clean as possible on that continuum. So every time we come back and touch and we add features, we should spend a little bit of that time, like you said, Chris, and chunk that off, and let's approve that part of the code that we're at. Let's lightly refactor. Let's, all the things that need to happen. Let's write better tests and increase our coverage. So
yeah, that's why I think, leaders think big picture, but sometimes you got to break it down for them and say, what if we went after this one thing, but then also create a showcase to be able to say, I went after this one thing, let me show you what it did, and the give back. It's, giving back into the team aspect. So thank you.
Kenny, any thoughts?
Yeah, I was kind of going to say the Boy Scout rule. I accidentally looked down to look it up on my phone. I was like, I remember what it's called, but I couldn't remember if it's called that or not. But yeah, you got to manage expectations a little bit. Be conservative when you estimate the effort level, so you can kind of pull in some new work, but also work on cleaning up old stuff. So you can kind of do both at the same time.
Okay, curious. So changing gears a little bit. I think there's more to talk about. I definitely want to talk about source control at some point. So I'm pinning it on the board, and then you all know better where to kind of layer source control into our conversation. But I think that's a big factor kind of as we kind of dive in a little deeper now. But yeah, I think so. We've talked about what is clean code. We've talked about why it matters to engineering teams and even business unit executives who might never take a look at Git. But what are some of the underpinning fundamentals, right? So if we put clean code is kind of like the, what's the Parthenon or the Pantheon, like whatever, the Acropolis, right? So you have like the thing that goes across the top, right? And then you've got these pillars that hold up the top of that temple, the temple to clean code. Like, what are the pillars that matter fundamentally to kind of keeping up the temple of clean code, as it were? We've talked about some of them. We've talked about self-documenting, kind of, easy to read, like just, I don't know, Chris, like, do you have some suggestions on some of those fundamental pillars that matter that you see with the teams you work with or you have over your career?
So I always talk in soft language, so somebody else can add a little bit of that technical speak to it. But I think about reusability. I think about flexibility. I think about how it's going to be used and potentially compartmentalizing it so that it can, it doesn't stay a monolith. Thinking about monolith to microservices, like how can you create components so that the components are reusable across the organization? Thinking beyond just what your application's use is going to be, solve problems that you think you're going to be coding for 10 years from now, not you're coding for today. Don't touch what you don't need. Like, don't leave it. Don't touch it if it doesn't have to be touched right this moment. Maybe make a note and bring it back. The other thing I think about is when you are touching something, try, like I think about the volume of commenting that I've seen in code. Why not let the code speak for itself? The code whispers at you. If you were to read top down, it tells its own story. So let the code tell the story. Kind of going back to the source control, when you're versioning the software and putting comments into the system, let the system be the comments, not internal to the software. And that's something was different for me. I came from, like I said, a manual testing background, and we opened defects for everything. And there was always this, like slap the ruler against the coder because they missed something, right? But when we stopped writing defects because the system itself was documenting it, it just became better. I think there's so many pillars that you could throw out there. Sorry.
Think about
the soft words.
No, think about the Acropolis. There's like a million pillars under that thing. So that's fine. I love what you just said about like the comments in the code. Like, we do a lot of design and kind of UX work where I work. And one of the things that we always say is like, if you have to explain it to somebody, you're probably doing it wrong. And so like, while that works in an interface, like on an app or, on a desktop app or whatever, if you have to like document what you're trying to explain to somebody, like you didn't do a really good job design, or you moved too quick or whatever. And so I think it sounds like the same applies in the engineering world too. If you have to explain what you're doing here, then you probably didn't do a good job doing it. Kenny or Brad, any thoughts there?
Yeah, I would go with, you mentioned source control earlier. So a lot of times I'll see comments that are either really long, explaining a really long method that's just hard to understand. I've seen outdated comments or just commented out code and go into the source control thing. It's kind of one of those things like you just don't need it. Like source control will keep that code in the future. You can go back.
Yep.
But I would also say another good thing to have is like well-tested code. We kind of hinted at like, no one should hope to write perfect, clean code the first time. I just don't think that's a realistic goal. But you're going to be changing it and refactoring it a lot. And if it's well tested, you can be pretty confident that as I refactor it, I'm not really breaking anything. It's still going to hold the original functionality. So
that's great.
Yeah.
Thoughts, Brad?
Yeah, definitely. I would echo all that. And, Chris was disparaging soft language for this, but I think it is a lot of soft language. There's not, there's not something you can say that like, oh, this method is only 5 lines, so it's clean. It's just not that simple, right? So a lot of it is going to be, rules of thumb and, trade secrets more than it's going to be hard and fast black and white rules. So, a rule of thumb is, can somebody who's code reviewing this understand it without explanation, right? Like Brian, you were saying, right? Do they get it? Do they understand what the code's doing, or do I have to walk them through it? If so, that's probably something we should work on, right? We should go back and rewrite it. I have an axiom from an old mentor that said, you don't write good code, you rewrite good code. And I've always kind of lived by that, right? It's very easy to go from something that's functional and working into something that's better and easy to maintain. So don't get caught up the first time you write it trying to write the perfect novel, right? Like those take edits, those take passes and revisions. So does code. So really treat your code that way. Don't be willing to come back and rewrite it from scratch now that you have a working version. So
yeah, you're bringing up something that I've made a note of in the past as well, is like if you were coding something and I was reviewing it, how would you feel if I cleared the screen and made you write it again? Would you write it the same way? You can kind of think about that from a clean code perspective too. If you were to go back and rewrite something that you wrote previously, cleared the screen, so to speak, and rewrote it, you probably wouldn't write it the exact same way because you've learned something over time. And I think that's where it's going to be really important with sharing what you're learning with somebody else. Don't hold it to yourself. Bring somebody else on that same journey with you. And if you, feel comfortable with calling it out if you're seeing something that needs to be done differently.
Yeah, that's great. I love that idea and kind of bringing people on the journey. We'll get to that in a second. But yes, that idea of like, if you have lots of bad code in your organization, like, okay, it clearly there's opportunity for improvement, but it also lets you know, like, you're kind of in it, or you're in a vicious cycle, right? So what do we need to do to break the vicious cycle? And we'll talk about some of that in a couple minutes here. But to get to that virtuous cycle, right? If you're taking your time as a person who understands the craft, you know, we talked about this last week, the idea of like, and Brad, you brought up the idea of a craftsperson. Like, there were people who were masons or carpenters or whatever, and they would have apprentices that came and learned from them and watched them and participated and you know, went alongside. And so sometimes we move too fast in software because there's too much software to build. We need to eat the world with software, right? As Andreessen said, like, so how do we, but we're not going to eat the world if, you know, we're not writing software. So, but right, we still need to be creating it virtuously. So I love that idea. One topic that came up that we had talked about before was the idea of quick to run. The code needs to be quick to run, and that could be in running your tests. It could be in compiling it. It could be in, you know, putting it into production. I think there's lots of applications for that. Who wants to talk about quick to run and why that matters to clean code?
I talked to a little bit. I think it's really important that you're able to exercise your code and get feedback from how it's working, how it's performing, or how it is to reuse it, how it is to work with that code as quick as possible. So if that feedback loop is hours or days long, you're just going to write it once and walk away, right? Because it takes too long to get that feedback. So the quicker you can get feedback on your code and how it's working, how it's performing, if it's easy to use, you know, the more readily you can improve it and respond to that feedback. So, you know, along that lines, you know, writing tests is kind of the quickest way you can do that, because when you write test code, you're actually implementing or executing the code that you've written. So tests are a really good first line of defense as a developer to see if your code is easy to use. Does it do the things you want it to do? Not even just functions, but is it, you know, easy to execute? Is it easy to call and work with? And I use tests a lot of the time to prove my design patterns out, more so than just the functionality.
Yeah, I'd go with the feedback loop, even relatively short feedback loops, maybe 30 minutes, 20 minutes, 15 minutes. It's very easy to get distracted while you're waiting for it. You go do something else. And then all of a sudden it's been an hour, 2 hours. So like, definitely the faster you can see it and keep it on your mind, it's definitely really useful.
I don't know if everybody's seen, I won't bring it up, but just type in like XKCD and compiling, like just type in that for that comic. It's a great cartoon I guess I'll explain the cartoon, but the idea is like there's two stick figures, and they're like sword fighting on top of like rolling chairs in the hall. And they're like, hey, what are you doing out there? And they're like, compiling, you know. Just it's the idea that like the compiling of the code takes so long, they have time to do a, you know, Pirates of Penzance sword fight or whatever. So yes, so right, it's easy to get distracted. It's easy to see what's going on Slack. It's easy to see what's going on elsewhere in the organization, and then like, what was I doing? And you get back to it. Before I worked at Simplethread, I worked at Corgi Bytes, which is a great business in town. They talk a lot about technical debt, and one of the things that Scott Ford, their CEO, often talks about is this idea of like the pyramid of tests, as he calls it. And so you have like unit tests, which is the lowest level of the pyramid, and then help me out team, like integration tests is kind of the next level up, and then you've got acceptance tests, and there's probably something else that I'm forgetting. But the idea that like you want to have, you know, this well throughout your organization so that you can run at a high level and run it all, or you can run at a unit level, or you can just run parts of it, but that it all kind of, you know, I guess it goes uphill or whatever, you know, goes to the capstone, or as it were. But yeah, is that something that
it's the pyramid versus the ice cream cone, like flipping it over, right?
Stripping everywhere. Yeah, exactly. Is that something that you all try and think about with your teams? Kind of how you work on, you know, I've seen applications where it's like they are great at acceptance tests, but not so good at unit tests, or, you know, vice versa, or things like that. Are those things that you try and shape? You can never get it perfect, but you're trying to shape with the teams you're working with.
That's what I live and breathe pretty much every single day, is those how to break the work down into smaller increments. And it kind of touches on what Kenny was describing, like the flexibility to feel comfortable with committing a single, a small increment of change multiple times in a day. And in many organizations that I work with, and many teams that I've worked with throughout time, it was probably one code deploy to test once a week. Like, right, they did the build deploy processes on Thursday. They launched on Thursday. They built deployed into the test environment, and then the software testers went off and started executing testing. And they took up to a week to run their testing, depending on if it's manual or automated, got the feedback back to the team. And they were already building and getting ready to build deploy the next thing. So you're always playing this, this catch up kind of thing. Like, so I've worked tremendously with breaking it down to the smallest increment and writing the test and the code simultaneously, getting the code and the test sitting side by side in the same source control library. Yes, in the same source control library. They don't have to be in different folders. And so they can exist together. They can sit nicely together. And in the build deploy process, allow that to execute. Now, granted, some tests take longer to run. And so maybe some of those tests aren't running with every build deploy, but getting that increment of being able to build and deploy multiple times a day. And guess what? If you're building and deploying multiple times a day in a dev environment using the same test that somebody else is going to run in a higher environment, you get that feedback faster, as Kenny was describing. So testing, having the test and the dev sitting close together, and your test has to be clean as well. Clean coding doesn't just mean code, it means having clean tests as well.
Yeah, I would add, like you mentioned, the code together. Like I'd push back on anyone that has like a PR that doesn't have tests in it. It's because it's very easy to like, oh, the code's real quick to write, but then when you think about the tests, a lot of people, when they're newer especially, it's just a hard thing to write and they feel like it's not worthwhile to them. They don't necessarily see the immediate impact. Maybe they're used to working with, oh, we deploy it, then we test it. That's where their comfort level is. But I think a lot of the stuff in this industry is kind of like pushing yourself out of that comfort level. Just try to learn more stuff. Testing definitely has benefits over time, but hard to recognize.
Yeah. So we've talked about reusability, flexibility, being able to compartmentalize, tests, quick to run, easy to read. Can you do it better? Refactoring, all those kind of things. Any other kind of fundamental underpinnings of kind of clean coding practice, easy to modify code, things like that, before we kind of start talking about some culture. We'll talk about a little bit of culture, and then we have a show and tell example that we'll walk through. But any other thoughts on kind of fundamental things we need to be thinking about? No. All right, cool. So I'm excited about this because I think we've got some experts in this subject. We've got experts on the coding side, but I think we also have experts on the cultural side. I got a real sense of that when I got to talk to everybody last week. So yeah, I think that the question here is, I was mentioning it, kind of alluding to it before, with the idea of kind of the goal is to create a virtuous cycle of healthy organizations, well-functioning organizations, well-communicating organizations. But like, what are some good? Similarly, I think we can all agree healthy, good functioning teams matters, and we understand why that matters. But what are some good ways? What are some good practices that you found in your work to share the wealth, as it were? That kind of artisan knowledge sharing with the journey person kind of coming in. Like, how do we share and create more great coders over time in your organization? What are some, Chris, why don't you start us off? What are some thoughts on that?
I start with one of the things I start with is creating psychological safety within the environment itself. And what does that environment look like? It's fearless. It's a fearless organization. You remove fault and failure patterns. Like, you remove the space of who wrote this? Why did you write this? Whose fault is this? What's the root cause? Who caused this production issue? Why is this written this way? You remove, like I said, the defect cycle, like this constant, like, oh my gosh, we have step 1 defects. We have all of these P1 incidents and things like that. You have to come to a fearless cycle in which it's okay to fail fast. It's okay to deliver something that's half baked. It's okay to break the build. It's okay, those kind of things. At the same time, doing things in iterative ways and pairing with somebody else, create the dynamism of collaborating, and test and fail as fast as you can, as often as you can. There's empathy when you're writing your code, and think about the fact that, what are you leaving behind so that you're not leaving a mental strain on someone else that has to take on that burden of the work that you've left behind.
Yeah. Those are all great. Kenny, what do you think?
I'd add imposter syndrome is a pretty big thing in this industry. I feel like most people feel it at some point in their career. And like places I've been, a lot of times the business is pushing them for more stuff on a shorter time frame. And you have to encourage people that it's okay to push back on that. You're not always going to deliver perfect code right away, and just iterate on it. Make sure that they know that they're not being judged. When I talk about some examples, sometimes I feel like maybe I'm like bashing the people that made the code, and that's not the intent. The intent is more of, let's help improve it. Like your first pass, okay, that it works, but like, how can we make that better? And like pairing with them, reviewing their code, showing them your examples, lead by example a little bit is all going to be really useful for that.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, I would, we're going to piggyback on each other here, but it's all that opportunity to collaborate and work together. Even, as somebody who's less experienced, being assertive and asking for time to pair with somebody more senior. Just, hey, can we work on this code together? Hey, can you watch me as I write this? What do you think of this design pattern? Ask a lot of questions. It's that humility to be able to not know something that's so important. When we're bringing people into RTS specifically, that it's just such a key trait and an indicator of somebody who's going to be really successful. They ask questions. They're hungry to learn more from the people around them who have been more experienced. And then if you're more experienced on the other side, I also think, that the cycle doesn't stop. The act of mentoring is really important, because explaining what you're doing makes you better. Being able to defend why you chose this design pattern, right, and answer questions as you go, pairing with somebody more junior, right, is a really great way to improve your code, to be self-critical of what you're writing, right? Like when I write code, the first time I write it, it's always garbage. And if I have somebody in the room with me who's just asking me, hey, Brad, why did you do that? Why did we name that variable that? What does that variable do? I don't understand. It just makes me better, right? It makes the code better in the long run. So it's good for everybody involved to really collaborate, work together, and be humble and be willing to continue to improve the skill.
Yeah, I think that's great. That was going to be my question. You all answered it, which was, if you have a very isolated, non-communicative organization, like what's a good way to start? And I think you all touched on it, but yeah, one would just be pairing, right? Just pairing, even if it's peers pairing, like that's better than not. But certainly if you can have a senior person pairing with a more junior person, that's great. And right, I think having that desire, that willingness to ask questions, especially if you're coming into an organization, or you're a junior person on a team, you have to ask lots of questions, because I've worked in all kinds of organizations, but the folks that are junior coming into senior organizations, like most organizations can withstand you not knowing everything, because there's just not enough engineers on the planet, right? Period, end of story. What they can't withstand is you being junior and either trying to figure it out all on your own, and going away and not communicating. And so I'm not trying to put this all on the junior person, but I think there's especially talking about imposter syndrome, like there's this fear of I'm going to be found out. People are going to know who or what I am. And I don't think I'm very good, or that kind of thing. And so right, it has to be both sided, where it's the junior person asking questions, but also the senior person, inviting them into, watch me flub some code together, like, because I'm a super duper typer on my whatever 2-piece keyboard, and then someone's looking over my shoulder and kablooey, I can't even type in one string or whatever. So like, but that has value, that has real value, right? So yeah, sorry, I'll get off the soapbox. What other things? So we've talked a little bit about virtuous cycle, we've talked about psychological safety. Chris, I want to dive in on that. I think we all hear that phrase and we know that phrase, but how does, when the rubber hits the road on psychological safety, like, give me an example of where someone felt unsafe and you had to let them know, hey, you're okay, like, we're in the trust tree here, or whatever. Like, I'm not trying to put anybody in trouble, but just give a an anonymized example of something like that.
So I think you have to approach it top down and bottom up. So from a bottom up perspective, so let me start with the top down. I think you have to start top down, having leaders understand what it means to work in more of an open, collaborative culture, and to empower their teams to make decisions and trust them. And they have to show body language, written language, all of their language has to showcase the fact that they are empowering their teams to do that. Without that, it makes it harder. Let's just assume that leaders are showing a capacity to have that open culture in which it's easy to be empowered and feel comfortable within your team. Then within the team, the developer bottom-up perspective, the psychological safety has to come in having the opportunity to voice your opinions, even if they're alternative opinions to someone else. There needs to be space for voicing of opinions that may or may not be the same as somebody else, and space to have that back and forth conversation around what that experience is like. And typically a coach to help coach through that. If you can, it's great to have somebody that's coaching that whole facilitating that opportunity to create the safety zone. But I just think about the fact that you have to create empowered teams. I've seen it in the past, where as a contractor working on a team that may have contractors and full-time associates, they have different dynamics by which they're being judged. And so you have to be able to bring your whole self into that engagement. So as a contractor in that particular space, your voice and opinion on how it should be done should be well received. Similarly, as an employee, having the space to have that open conversation. I'm probably not touching exactly on what you're looking for, but
no, that's helpful. I think that's
definitely
helpful.
Empowered team, open communications, and the right channel in which to have those communications.
Yeah, and being open about incentives, right? Like that, like, hey, as a senior engineer, what's my this person's bothering me again, like, I got to answer this question for the 100th time, right? Like, what's their incentive? And so I think if you can be open and transparent about incentives, like, if you can help this person come along, like, it's going to make your life easier in the long run. Yes, maybe we should put some office hours or something on this so that they're not knocking on your cube every 5 minutes, right? Like, that could be bad too. So finding the give and take and all these things, that's great. Cool. Well, we have a little bit of time left. We have about 15 minutes left. I want to get to our show and tell. We'll have some time for questions at the end. Hopefully some of our attendees will give some questions. So Nick, if you're out there, if you could share the slide. So Brad Phillips from RTS Labs we were talking about, hey, what are some examples of clean coding? And so Brad kindly volunteered, and he's going to take us through something here. So Brad, floor is yours. Please.
Yeah, I struggled last week trying to write bad code like this, and it was hard. So I'll poison the well a little bit and say, I hate this line of code in front of me. So RTS, when we interview candidates, we occasionally give a take-home problem just to screen. And the take-home problem we give, this is a sample answer to one of those problems. And I wrote this myself, so you can blame me for the bad code. We're not calling anybody out, but this is an example of a perfectly functional.
Brad, there's psychological safety here. We're good. We're going to rewrite this code.
We're going to rewrite it. That's
okay,
exactly
buddy.
right. This is an example of a perfectly functional answer. This line of code, this function here, does everything we ask when we give this problem. It is technically correct. And if we were evaluating this line of code, or if I saw this code in a pull request, I would fail it instantly, because I think if you read it, and anybody on the the panelists haven't seen this line of code either. I think they're probably trying to figure out exactly what it does as well too. So if we switch to the next slide, I'll show you the same functionality in code. Thank you, Nick. This is the exact same functionality in code. And now this example is a little contrived. This is a little verbose. I get it, right? But for example's sake, um, these three functions do the same thing. And the first two functions are helper functions, but the last function here is what that first line of code in the previous slide is doing. It's taking a string, for example, my string, and rotating the characters in it by a number a number of characters based on an integer you provide. And what I did is as I worked with another senior developer at RTS, and we spent some time just refactoring and refactoring. I think this is probably about past 10. And I even look at it now and I'm like, I'd probably change something about it. So, this is us trying to break apart that functionality into small bits. And, Chris talked a lot about making small bits that we can test, right? That previous line of code on the other slide is not testable code. You have no way to know what's going into that black box and out, right? If there's a bug in this line of code, I would take all day to figure out what it is, and I'd probably end up rewriting it. Versus the better example, Nick, you're reading my mind. Nope, you did it. And this code is easy. The functionality is split out into separate things. I can come into this code and reason about where I'm at. Sure, it's more lines of code, and I think a lot of developers think that's harder to read. But the lines of code, like Chris said, are whispering to us. They're telling us their functionality. They're indicating where they can be used and reused if we wanted to split this code apart in the future. So this is just a very short, contrived example saying that if I saw this in a pull request, this is infinitely better than the first slide. We shouldn't be optimizing for clever tricks or one-line answers. Really, we should be optimizing for coming back and reading this code and understanding what it meant. So
I love it. I don't know if any of you, I've just started watching this show, Ted Lasso, which is great on Apple Plus, but there's like the one player who's the superstar player, and Ted Lasso tells him, like, at one point, he's like, it's you against a million or whatever, or you're 1 in a million or whatever. But if you look at it as if like you're 1 of 11, meaning like you're one member of 11 on this team, like you could really be special, right? And so I think, the first example is an example of like, I'm 1 in a million. I did this in, 3 lines, whatever, pat myself on the back. Good job. Job done. Let's ship it. Right. This is the 1 of 11. Sorry. The second example there, that's like the 1 of 11 example where, right, it's like, hey, I'm inviting other people to participate in this, and they can drop in on this and get to a place where they're going to be able contextually to quickly pick it up. And participate in this, or maybe they'll have ideas on how to make it better, or maybe I'm not going to maintain this code base forever. Like, raise your hand if you've maintained one code base over the entirety of your career. No one would do that, right? So someone else will be looking at this, right? So one kind of invites more people to understand what's happening there. Love it. Chris, Kenny, any thoughts on Brad and kind of what he came up with here, the example he gave us?
It's good. I would say, like, the biggest thing I would point out is, like, when you're trying to fix a bug or something, a lot of times you want to set breakpoints and stuff. And like that first line of code, it's going to be nearly impossible to do that. Whereas the second example, that would be really easy to kind of narrow down where the actual issue is. So.
Yeah, and I echo that. The first thing that I saw whenever I saw the first example was, holy cow, how many variations of link slice and do I have to come up with to test this? Because there's going to be a lot of variations to that. But when you get into testing of the second variation, it's definitely going to make, you can get your test cycle down a little bit smaller and iterate through it a lot faster, because the fact that it is a lot cleaner. So the other way, I would have been testing it 10 different ways, and we would have been like 30 minutes into a testing cycle, just because I'm going to try and break it.
Cases, right? Who knows if you have all the cases?
Got to have all the cases to break it.
Or if there's an off by 1 error, which there was the first time I wrote this line of code, I literally had to break it apart to fix it and then put it back together in this ugly way.
This is great. Okay, so any other thoughts on this example? Thank you for taking the time, and thank your coworker for helping you, take 10 turns of the crank on this. That was great, and I think that exemplified well that less is not always better. And right, yeah, how do we invite other people to participate in this? So in that spirit of inviting others to participate, I know we have some attendees. I would love to if people have questions, if they can raise them. I'm looking in the chat. Okay, Andrea says she loves the example. Do people have questions for our panelists? Please go ahead and throw them in the Q&A or the chat. I think Q&A would be easier for me. I can look there. It'll bundle them up more easily. But does anybody have any questions? We'll see if any come in. What I want to talk a little bit about resources before we go, but one question that I have is there anything for you panelists that's been like a real, kind of seminal text or, like life-changing, altering moment in terms of your work, that you read something or a book or, follow someone on Twitter or whatever, where you felt like they were really helpful for you to understanding clean code in a deeper way?
I think one of the big things we kind of all mentioned last time was Clean Code by Robert Martin, which I have like right next
Bob
to
Martin,
me.
yep. There you go. Look at that.
I read it a long time ago with a bunch of EPOM people, and while I was reading it, there were tons of things that maybe you're taught in school, like comment a lot, that he kind of rails against, and it definitely had some things that you don't even recognize, and then you read it and you're like, oh, well, that makes tons of sense, of course.
Chris or Brad, any other examples other than Uncle Bob?
That's the big one that I always reference. That's a fantastic book. Really got me past the part of my career where I was like, I'm gonna write the cleverest code possible. Like that's how I came to coding, is trying to be as clever and out clever anybody else around me. And the moment that I was like, oh, I should make this code understandable to humans was a really big moment for me.
Good. Chris, anything specifically?
No, I think you've touched on the ones that I was thinking on, and I wish I could have thought about it ahead of time, but there is like various Slack groups that, I think that is a place that I would go to. I'd have to go find the ones that that I have.
I can help you. I can help you with one. Legacy Code Rocks is one. Go to legacycode.rocks. And that is both Andrea and Scott's podcast, as well as their Slack community. I think you can get to from there. That's a great place where people like to talk about refactoring and clean code. I've asked the rvatech team to put some examples up. I'm not going to read all the ones, but if you go back to the page for this event on rvatech, it'll have a list of some examples. I didn't get to put a slide together, but I'll read off a couple books here that I think have been helpful and fundamental for me. One is Working Effectively with Legacy Code by Michael Feathers. Sandy Metz's, it's a Ruby book. So if you're not interested in Ruby, it might be less interesting, but Practical Object-Oriented Design for Ruby by Sandy Metz, fantastic book. A gentleman I got to meet once, his name is Joost Visser. He's a Belgian or Netherlands, whatever. It's called Building Maintainable Software. That's an O'Reilly book. That's a good one. And then Andy Hunt and Dave Thomas, Pragmatic Programmer. There's other great stuff too that we'll put in there. But those are great starting points. And then of course, the Legacy Code Rocks podcast. I am looking for questions. I do not see any questions. So does anybody have questions before we go? Harper Trout, I see you out there. I know you have to have a question about clean code. It's all you think about all day, every day. So I'm going to put him on the spot. But do you, any parting thoughts? Okay. Andre asks a question. Any thoughts about code smells?
I was gonna jump in earlier, but I knew we were running out of time, so I'm so glad you asked. Part of the craftsmanship that I think it takes to be a good developer is training your nose, right? In a very literal sense, and knowing and being able to have that gut feeling that this is wrong, this could be better. It's I joked about looking at that second example today and being like, I could probably make this better, but it's that sort of intuition that's really important. And I think the way you train that goes back to something Chris said about, asking those questions and being able to probe and think open-minded and critically about the code you're looking at, while you're pairing, ask, is there another way we could do this? Is there a way that we could make this more extensible or make this easier to test? And just ask those open-ended questions and really train your nose to look at those examples.
Yeah. Great, thank you. Any other thoughts on code smells there, Kenny or Chris? Nick, you can jump in too if you have thoughts on code smells. Nick, feel free, please.
I think I'd agree with that.
Kenny or Chris.
Well, thank you, Brian. Now that you say that, I do have quite.
Oh no, we don't want to hear it. We don't want to hear it. Kenny or Chris, any thoughts? No, they're good. Okay, we have one last question, then we're going to let everybody go before they go to their 1 o'clock Zoom call. Harper Trow, I called him out. Congratulations, Harper. I don't know if there's an answer to this question. This might be, one of those impossible to answer questions, but here we go. What's the GitHub repo that you have read with the cleanest code you have ever seen? So maybe that's a good open source question. Like maybe you work on open source projects and you see some really good, well-written, well-maintained, clean code. That might be the easiest way to answer that. Any thoughts? It could also be your own. That can be an acceptable answer.
My code is not the cleanest code. We're all trying, right? We're all on the grind.
That's right. Any examples or thoughts of things you've seen that you're like, wow, that's really, really impressive?
I got a cheat one from someone. If you make a JHIP strap and you use that just freshly generated, and there you go. So.
That's a great answer. Yes. If you just start a new repo, that's the cleanest one you've ever seen. I think that's actually probably the right answer. That's probably the right answer. It's going to. I think that's the point. Maybe the takeaway here is it's going to get dirty. We have to do our best to keep it clean and organized, and as best we can. But the most important thing is to be human about it. Build good teams. Have good communication. Talk through the process, and then hold to high standards on teams. It doesn't mean that we're being mean or unfair. It just means that it's an opportunity to dialogue. If you just let bad stuff through the gate, then you're going to get, it's gigo, right? It's basically that's what's going to happen. So with that, we have 1 minute left. I've done it. We've landed the plane, everybody. Good job. We did it in under an hour. Chris from Red Hat, thank you. Kenny from IPON, thank you. Brad from RTS Labs, thank you. Nick, thank you for running tech, and it's all you now.
All right. Well, thanks, Brian. Thanks, Kenny, Brad, Chris. Appreciate y'all's time, and thanks everyone for joining us on your lunch hour. We know you have other Zooms to go to, so we'll see you next time on RVA Tech's Tech It Yourself.